In this session, we'll focus more on how we can actually involve the private sector and how we can really start working with them, and what kind of business model seems to be emerging from our engagement so far. We have a rich panel. We have 6 panelists that are going to address us today. We'll start with Håvard Wiltshire from Rystad Energy, who will give us an overview presentation. And then we have Yvette Cowrie, the team leader of engineering and infrastructure team from UNDP. And we have Saratullah from the UN Logistics Division. Mark Gibson from UNITAR, GPA, he's joining us online. And then we have Camilla Fulland from NORCAP, and then Marcus Williams from Miga. So I'll bring them in, but first then I will give the floor to Håvard Wiltshire, who's going to give us an overview of the market potentials, and he's going to show us some slides. And by the way, we will distribute all the slides to all participants.
Thank you. So my name is Håvard Wiltshire. I work for a company called Rystad Energy, which is a consultancy and business intelligence firm focused on the energy industry. I thought I'd use this opportunity to give kind of a primer or a one-on-one on kind of the conditions for renewables to succeed as they look in 2023. And I'll explain this in the context of what we call the energy trilemma. It's fairly global in nature, but I'll also kind of draw parallels to regions where the UN has, for instance, peacekeeping operations as part of this. So first of all, what is the energy trilemma? It's a concept where we kind of acknowledge that when bodies such as governments plan for a certain energy future, then there's always this struggle between sustainability, affordability, and reliability. And then kind of depending on the market sentiment at any given point in time, then we kind of place ourselves on different points in this triangle that you see here. So kind of the ruling sentiment since about 2015, or kind of the later part of the previous decade, was a focus on sustainability. With kind of increasing commodity prices in the fall of 2021, that sentiment for private actors in the market shifted very much towards affordability, before finally, with kind of the conflict in Ukraine, a focus on reliability became higher on the agenda and has kind of been reigning ever since. And part of the context here is that many of the regions that are relevant for today's discussion have kind of always found themselves in the upper end of this triangle, with reliability being a constant challenge. So although kind of this focus on reliability is fairly new in the West, then it's always been a challenge for these kinds of regions. And what we've kind of learned in the last year or so is that this isn't necessarily an equal struggle between the 3 concepts here, but rather a hierarchy of needs where you want to satisfy reliability, and then affordability, and then sustainability. Now the good news in 2023 is that if you look at renewable power sources, they score fairly well on all of these dimensions, although there are certain nuances, especially when we look at conflict zones, which I'll discuss in kind of the following slides. So you see that kind of renewable scores pretty well on all of these, and then coal scores well on the reliability and affordability aspect, but then of course scores pretty terribly on the sustainability portion of this. So why is that relevant? Well, different nations tend to kind of prioritize different parts of this pyramid. So while in the West, kind of the ongoing energy crunch has been responded with a focus on renewable energy, then kind of economies which are experiencing more growth, say, they will still kind of lean on reliable power sources in their regions, such as coal. So that's kind of one aspect where reliability plays into kind of future power mix. And then there's kind of reliability in the sense of delivering power every hour of every day. And there kind of different power sources have different features. So you have dispatchable power sources, which are kind of the most flexible, like coal and gas, where you can kind of vary the output to match demand. at any given point of the day. You have base load power sources like nuclear, where you get kind of a flat output of energy that's kind of consists throughout the day, but with very limited ability to kind of scale up and down. And then you have intermittent power sources, where kind of nature essentially decides, and where kind of the wind is going to blow whenever it's going to blow, and you'll just have to kind of accept that power when it comes to you. So when kind of applying these power sources to a type of grid setting, this is what it looks like. So for instance, if you have gas or coal, that kind of pairs well with renewable power sources, because you can scale up the supply output from the gas and the coal, and then you can kind of meet that demand line, whereas the alternative would be to kind of curtail or kind of pass up on the renewable power sources. So this is kind of relevant in a grid setting. I realize that for many of the kind of regions that we're talking about today, you might not necessarily have a grid available, but this still teaches us something about kind of the relevance of solar, in that, for instance, you would need to couple solar with a battery to kind of be able to supply power more or less 24/7 in a kind of off-grid setting or a microgrid setting. So kind of there are inherent weaknesses with renewable energy in terms of kind of the reliability in a kind of hour-by-hour setting. The good news is that as it looks in 2023, renewable power sources, they are able to generate power at costs lower than fossil power sources. You see solar and wind are the kind of the bars all the way to the left there. And then you have kind of your fossil power sources towards the right in this graph here. So the number we present here with, for instance, solar, the kind of leftmost graph is a global average for a figure called an LCOE, so kind of the average cost at which you're able to generate power. Although there are several nuances to this figure, where we've kind of identified 6 of them here. So the scale at which you're able to roll out the power is very important. So a kind of a utility scale or kind of giga scale plant would have lower costs inherently. There's the capacity factor, so essentially kind of the strength of the sun wherever you're installing the power. There's the cost of capital, which is very relevant for this discussion, which is kind of a reflection of the risk that you're facing as a developer of renewable energy. There's the kind of energy storage aspect. Are you adding energy storage to the renewable power? Are you facing curtailment? Do you kind of have to sacrifice some of your production because supply is higher than demand at any given point in time? And then there's other kind of considerations beyond that. So we've done these exercises before. We've kind of mapped different projects in different regions according to how well they kind of place on this framework here with the 6 steps. As for kind of the regions that are most relevant today, so kind of conflict zones or post-conflict zones, you would maybe look at kind of microgrids in a higher degree than you would normally do, given that there might be a lack of infrastructure. So kind of on the scale dimension here, you would probably be on kind of the lower end, so low-scale projects. In terms of capacity factor, we know that countries like South Sudan have kind of excellent conditions for solar, for instance. Countries like Somalia have excellent conditions for wind and offshore wind. So that's kind of a positive feature for these countries in particular. Then there's kind of the 3rd step here, the cost of capital, which you would expect to be higher in these regions, given that there's a higher risk involved than kind of your average offshore wind development in Norway, say. You would likely need to add energy storage to many of the renewables developments in these regions, given the kind of lack of a grid. But then an added bonus to that is that you have to curtail less of the energy you produce. So that's just to kind of put this in the context of the regions that we're kind of discussing today. And kind of zooming in on that 3rd step here, that kind of affects renewables particularly because you make many of the investments up front. So you have a large capex cost up front with renewables often, and then a low Opex component following that. And then kind of a discounted value setting, then kind of the higher the cost of capital that you need to apply, the more expensive the renewable project becomes in a kind of business case NPV type setting. So very relevant to talk about kind of risk in this discussion. I think that was all, and then I'm sure the other panelists can give concrete examples.
Thank you very much, Håvard, for highlighting the energy trilemma. I would actually put energy security, not reliability, in the slide, but of course these days the key words in energy is energy security and just transition. And you also have demonstrated quite well that renewable energy is actually the most competitive solution in many markets, but you brought in the final point, and that was the cost of capital, which of course makes things somewhat difficult in many markets, but I'm quite sure that our panelists will dive more into this issue. So then I would like to give the floor to Yvette, who can then kick off providing some of the perspectives from the UNDP.
Is there a particular question you would like me to answer?
No, it's what is UNDP doing in this area in terms of supporting countries and supporting companies?
Yes. Obviously, we try to participate as much as possible to business seminars such as this one. In just the recent past, we participated in the EU Procurement Forum, April 2023, where we, and along with the environment team as well, we presented our vision, our goals, and what are we currently doing. We also try to attend trade fairs as much as possible. We did attend just recently in June in Munich. We attended a trade fair for renewable energy solutions, which many companies were there. It's a huge trade fair. And within the trade fair, the Italian-German Chamber of Commerces, they constructed a business seminar where we also presented and did something similar to this conference. Currently, we don't have a big pool of vendors who are registered with us in renewable energy. So we are trying to reach out to as much as possible to the market. We recently actually circulated some of our RFIs and EOIs in this area to chambers of commerce's contacts that we have within our departments. We try to get more and more of these contacts, and we distribute them as well through those routes. And we ask of them to distribute within their respective countries. We are trying also something that we are working together with the Enabling and Outreach Unit within DOS as well, to try to see which countries are leading in this industry, to see if they can also conduct business seminars in their regions, and whether virtual or in person, that we would also be happy to participate in and spread the word. So these are the few things that we're trying to do to enlarge our pool of vendors, for sure.
Thank you very much, Yvette. And I said you were from UNDP, but that was wrong. It was the UN Procurement Division.
Yes.
So it was the same letters, but in a different order, so sorry about that. Saratullah, from the UN Logistics Division, you've also worked as an engineer out in the field. So what could you provide us with your perspectives on how that the UN Logistics Divisions could help them in this area?
Thank you so much. Yes, renewable energy shift is a key priority.
Can you speak a little bit closer to the microphone? So.
Yes, as you hear from our senior management a little bit before, renewable energy is a key priority for us as in Logistic Division. Currently, predominantly our energy is sourced from diesel generators, which is obviously not only environmentally not friendly, also it adds additional pressure on our missions in the field in terms of logistic convoys, which is predominantly fuel as well, which also increase the security threat to our personnel and the mission. So we are pushing towards changing that dynamic of energy to renewable energy. Our current approach is that we take three key priorities to move towards renewable energy. The first one is, which we have started a decade back, and that is a gradual increase of renewable energy through our in-house solar or wind and other forms of renewable energy installation. That is in-house renewable energy installation, which is obviously dependent on space availability and also in terms of network stability concern associated with that. The second approach is we are looking to connect to grid where it is available and it is from renewable sources. Unfortunately, in very few of the locations, it is a possibility because wherever we are operating, there are like less secure areas where the energy supply is limited, and in few of the locations where it is a possibility, we are prioritizing to connect to local grid, which is from renewable energy sources. The third approach, which is very important and that will play a key role in transforming our energy outlook, is energy as a service approach, where a service provider could establish renewable energy plants, and we will procure renewable energy from those providers. That will be our key steps to predominantly help us achieve the 80% target by 2030. Yes, we are like very behind from that target for the time being, but with the steps we are taking, we are expecting that once we implement in few of the locations successfully the energy as a service approach, we can then replicate that quickly in other areas that will help us push exponentially in the later years. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really good that you ended on a positive note, that you are optimistic that we will achieve this 80% target and that we have the model, and also the message that you came to focus on the service approach. And I said in my previous intervention saying that, of course, the missions is not really set up to be power producers. They have lots of other stuff to do, and that should be their key priority. But then now let's bring in Mark Gibson, operational lead, the global platform of action from UNITAR. So Mark, you're bringing in a different perspective here, since you are in the humanitarian side, and of course you are grappling with the same issues. It's about the same number of diesel generators that humanitarian agencies operate. Of course, it's costing them a lot also, and you've also taken steps then to address this issue of reducing the number of diesel generators among the humanitarian agencies. So it would be great if you could offer some of your experiences from the GPA. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans Olav. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Brilliant. And thank you for the kind introduction and invitation to participate in today's event, albeit remotely. And as you mentioned, Hans Olav, this is a great opportunity to transfer some knowledge that we've learned from the humanitarian sector to the peacekeeping colleagues that are on today's call. And also thank you for this opportunity to introduce the Global Platform for Action on Sustainable Energy and Displacement Settings, or GPA for short. For those of you that don't know us, the GPA is housed at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. We're a global initiative to promote actions that enable sustainable energy access and use in displacement settings. We strive to remove barriers to energy access in humanitarian settings by providing a collaborative agenda for energy development and humanitarian partners to deliver concrete actions around SDG 7, which is energy access for all. We also, which is more relevant to today's event, promote and contribute to the humanitarian sector's transition to renewable energy, which will increase its efficiency and reduce costs and carbon emissions. As Hans Olav pointed out at the beginning in my introduction, along with peacekeeping operations, humanitarian organizations are over-reliant on diesel generators. For instance, a recent study conducted by ourselves established that 7 humanitarian agencies are using more than 11,000 generators globally. Initial conservative estimates that at least 7 humanitarian agencies spend more than $100 million on fuel per year, emitting approximately 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide. In addition, we've also estimated that a total investment of around $250 million would be necessary to solarize viable systems, which would save around about $70 million in fuel per year, which is a return on investment of approximately 3.5 years. This would also result in around 125,000 tons of CO2 being saved per year. To support the decarbonising of humanitarian operations, the GPA and its partners, NORCAP and UNDP, have developed the Decarbonising Humanitarian Energy Multi-Partner Trust Fund, otherwise known as the DHE. This multi-partner trust fund will provide humanitarian actors with a centralised service to develop business cases to support their transition from diesel-based infrastructure to more sustainable energy solutions, such as solar and solar hybrid systems. The country-wide approach adopted by the DHE will address a number of challenges faced by humanitarian partners, including but not limited to the lack of technical resources, lack of funding for energy assessments, ongoing piecemeal approaches to decarbonising activities, small system sizes, and remote locations, of all of which increase the cost of transitioning to cleaner solutions. In order to address this cost, the DHE partners will be seeking to bundle systems together during the contracting process to make it more financially interesting to companies and driving down system costs. We will also be promoting the use of power purchase and leasing agreements above the more traditional acquisition procurement solution, and I'll go into this in more detail in today's panel discussions. And given that the GPA will not be involved in the procurement process of the DHE and the acquisition of those solutions, we can actually hold market dialogues with solution providers, where we can present an overview of the need within a particular country and potential timelines for the procurement of cleaner energy systems, giving the commercial sector a heads up and an early opportunity to engage within the processes. The solution that we're presented also helps to avoid a common pitfall. As I mentioned earlier, many of the UN agencies don't have the human capacity to undertake assessments, and we therefore call in a private sector company to provide technical support, only to find out later that it's barred from the procurement process at a later stage because it cannot bid on the process that it is already designed. This is a very quick overview of what we're doing within the humanitarian sector, and I think there's quite a lot of opportunities that we can promote within the peacekeepers and are doing so to actually fast track them to decarbonising their activities. Thank you, Hans, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for highlighting that humanitarian agencies are actually moving forward, and you made a really strong business case that, of course, also applied to the peacekeeping missions. 250 million in investments and 70 million in savings. That's a pretty good return. Wish my savings could have given me the same rate of return. And also that the key approaches that the humanitarian agencies have been developing that I will ask you to outline a little bit more afterwards in the panel discussion. But then I think also Mark gave a really nice cue to you, Camilla, from NORCAP, because we need the human capacity and the expertise. And NORCAP, for me, I'm biased, but I've been following NORCAP a long time, and for me it's an excellent program that actually provides technical capacity, expertise to the various agencies, and I think that is really important, even though at the end of the day these agencies also need to commit their own resources to it. But Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hans Olav. I thought I'd say
and by the way, it's supported by the Norwegian government, so we are a little bit, yeah.
I thought I'd say a few words about NORCAP, and to start off, because maybe not everyone is familiar with NORCAP and what we do. So NORCAP is a part of the Norwegian Refugee Council, and we work within the humanitarian and the peace-building sector together with international and national partners across the globe. So with regards to renewable energy, which I'm leading at NORCAP, NORCAP is the world's largest provider of energy expertise within the humanitarian sector. Our areas of expertise include solar energy, we work on bioenergy, clean cooking solutions, highly important, energy efficiency, decarbonization, also coordination and policy. Right now we have 35 energy experts that have supported 59 missions covering 23 countries spread across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. So the way we work is that NORCAP partners and we provide expertise to organizations within the humanitarian sector that are ambitious with regards to changing the way they use energy and also highly ambitious with regards to enabling access for displaced populations. Right now, we provide energy experts to 10 strategic partners within the humanitarian energy sector. Some of our partners include UNHCR, IOM, NRC, of course, the UNITAR through the GPA, and UNDP, amongst others. So what do we do and how do we work? So what our experts do in very close collaboration with the partner agencies is working to develop innovative financing mechanisms and market creation models, highly important. Also different pathways for increasing access to renewable energy for displaced populations, as well as decarbonization of particularly UN operations. So we have been providing this expertise since 2018, and through all these missions we have gained a lot of valuable experiences and lessons learned that we do think are also applicable to the peacekeeping missions and also maybe other sectors. So I think one of the key enablers that we see is the access to technical experts that have the knowledge of the context. These are fragile settings and difficult context. And also how partners work and how to engage with all stakeholders to design and deliver solutions that meet the specific need is one of the key important factors we find from our experience. And also the increased knowledge sharing. It's highly essential to avoid duplicating efforts, and we see that too many times that is done. And also that partners working in the same context should join forces to complement each other and not compete. And tearing down the silos and working through partnership models. And then also, as has been mentioned already, the importance of strong leadership buy-in for clean energy and sustainable approaches is a key for enabling and driving this change, because that enables policies to change, that enables a more favorable environment for renewable energy. And also, I want to mention the national policy development and UN's policy changes to accommodate for both renewable energy, but also private sector collaboration, because these two have not collaborated too closely before. So there's a need to move together, so to speak. And then, as was also mentioned earlier, the need for integration of renewable energy into the planning and strategy process and the infrastructure to support the programs and also operations from the very, very early beginning. Yes, we see that as a very important enabler to drive the scale of renewable energy within this context. I think I'll leave it at that, so thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and I think it's fair to say, Mark, that without the support from NORCAP, we will not have been where we are today in terms of moving this agenda within the humanitarian setting. Of course, we're also, I didn't mention that in the previous session, but Germany has supported Chris Hodder, Johnson is supported by Ireland, and we have also provided resources to the UN to hire climate and security advisor. And I think we have now 5 or 6 missions with climate and security advisors. So we all need to come up with resources to support and provide the necessary expertise. And then, of course, we have the climate and security mechanism within the UN that is also helping out to ensure this. But then let's move to Marcus Williams, Global Head and Sector Manager from Miga, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is part of the World Bank group. And Miga has been involved in, we've already heard that Miga has been mentioned because you've been helping out to structure some of the deals that have been made in this area. It's a little bit unfair, maybe, Marcus, to ask you also to take on the broader hat of the World Bank, but you're part of the group, and I've noticed an increased interest from the World Bank side also on the issue, leaving no one behind issue. So if you could also briefly address that, would be great. But then start with your Miga, and how can Miga help out on this?
Certainly. Well, firstly, thank you very much, and hello everybody, and thank you for inviting us to be here. So I'm Marcus Williams. I'm part of the Global Head of Energy and Mining at Miga. For those of you who don't know, and a lot of people don't know, the World Bank Group has a few different institutions within it. There's the World Bank itself, which is focused on really the public sector, lending, and the whole dialogue with governments. There's the IFC, which is the investment banking arm, and then there's Miga, which is the guarantee arm. And our mandate is to help crowd private investment, foreign private investment, into developing countries, and to do it through the use of guarantees, which is a very sort of niche instrument that most people don't really know. And essentially what that means is that if you can imagine an investor or a bank that is thinking about putting money into a developing country, they're looking at all of the different issues that anybody would look at, regarding a commercial business plan. Do we think this makes sense? And, do we have customers, and so on? But there's also a large concern around the non-commercial risks, which is probably a polite way of saying, the government could suddenly interfere and change our tax regime, or they could suddenly come and seize our assets, take away our equipment, deny us, access to our plant or our factory. And so what we do is we put a guarantee in place that basically says, if you make an investment of $25 million in this project, and the government does do something that comes in and interferes with your project, firstly, we will use our position to go and try to resolve the problem. The government is our shareholder as well, because we're a multilateral institution. But in the event that we're unsuccessful in solving the problem, we will then pay you, and we'll compensate you for your loss, and then we'll take it up privately with the government. So that's sort of our business model and what we do. And it's it's a real impediment as you look at investment flows around the world, and you see how much of it goes to, first of all, industrial versus developing countries, and then particularly when you look to the most fragile countries. And today, I think we are really talking about the most fragile investment environments of all. The share of global investment that gets captured by those countries is very, very small. So anyway, so that's what we do. And as Hans Olav said, we've been involved in the UN project with Cube Energy, and Mads Hansen is here somewhere, and I think he's speaking next, and he'll tell us more about it, but in Somalia. And it's a really interesting project. I think there are a lot of things, and we've heard also from other speakers this morning about the role that the UN is playing and the peacekeeping operations are playing in the different countries where they're engaged. I think in Somalia, it's about 40% of the total power generated in the entire country is coming from the UN system. And as we've also heard, most of it so far has been on fossil fuels, on diesel-based generators. So there are lots of reasons why moving towards solar power or renewable power makes a lot of sense. It's sort of interesting. I think that the charts, Harvard, you put up at the beginning are really interesting. I think in most of the countries where we are operating, and Somalia is the exception for us for sure, but mostly where we're working is in the lower income countries. I would say that your hierarchy of choices is probably inverted, whereas I think most host governments, what they care most about is access and I guess reliability. With it, affordability, probably yes. Sustainability is not a concern. You know, it's a concern only in the sense that if it just happens that the cheapest power is also clean, then great. But otherwise, we just need power. That is sort of the message that we get, which is, so anyway, what we're seeing now, and we've heard also this today as well, is we've now sort of got a convergence where we're seeing that the cheapest power and the most reliable power can in fact also be the cleanest power, which is great. Now, I think what's really interesting about this initiative, and we're obviously at the very front end of this initiative of trying to find a way to use UN peacekeeping operations to bring clean power into countries, is that it's sort of an icebreaker. I've sort of realizing more and more, and I think for us, the experience in Somalia has demonstrated that. I should mention, by the way, we've also heard that it's taken 3 years to get this project, the Cube project, off the ground. You know, that's actually, unfortunately, nothing to be embarrassed about in a way. It takes a long time to get these projects going, even in countries that are more robust than Somalia, and even in the best of times. And frankly, right now, we're in the worst of times, I would say. Maybe it could get worse still, perhaps, but you know, if you look at the global economy, all of the different crises that are all coming together, quite apart from the climate crisis, which is becoming much, much more real and I think severe, but the food crisis, the fuel crisis, inflation, debt. There are a lot of headwinds that are making things very, very difficult right now. Supply chain problems, particularly for solar companies that are sourcing panels. There are a lot of issues. So 3 years is actually not really too far away from the normal, unfortunately. But one of the things that we've seen with the Somalia case has been how many other issues need to be addressed. And I think it was mentioned earlier about you know, land issues, but you know, registration issues, basic issues to do with the authority. You know, who's sort of in charge? Is it the central government? Is it the Southwest state government? Is it the utility? Is it the Ministry of Energy? And we've been able to use this project to sort of identify and begin to address a lot of those issues. So yeah, so I think there's huge opportunity going forward. I think if I could maybe just add one other thing, which is that, you know, it's interesting looking at this. You see all these different stakeholders that are coming together to make this happen. You've obviously got a host country, you've got their population, many of whom are, you know, in very vulnerable positions anyway. You've got the UN, you've got the private investor who is being asked to come in and provide this service. And there's no question that the private sector is best positioned to do that. But everybody's got their own. There are a lot of things where people have common objectives, but there are also a lot of things where people have individual constraints and concerns that need to be handled. And I think one of the things about this system is that any investor who is coming in to provide energy is going to be, you know, I'm sure they're going to share a lot of the climate ambitions and the humanitarian ambitions that everybody else in that stakeholder group will have. But they've also got their own shareholders, they've got regulators, they've got auditors, all of these things that they have to be responsive to. And so I think one of the things that the UN can be doing, and I think is doing, is to make sure, and we talked a lot about procurement earlier, but an investor needs some sense of the long-term plan. They need to be able to recover their investment and then to make a return. And that's, you know, that's the proper thing. So the fact that in the case of the Somalia project, I think it was sort of the exception that a 5-year contract was issued with a 5-year extension. But that's the sort of thing that can really help make it a lot easier for a private company to come in and know that, you know, they can't just go from a year-to-year basis. With that, let me stop and thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for highlighting what Miga and the World Bank Group can offer into this, and also the fact that it takes some time. There are different perspectives. If 3 years is a short or long term, or long time, but I fully understand what you are saying, since I'm normally saying in this business it takes time and then some more time, but unfortunately many private sector representatives don't have that long time. So we need to make sure that we are working as expeditiously as possible. But of course, then we have this issue of what the governments themselves need to do. They need to do a lot. I would also say that since I'm not always diplomatically correct, when we are blaming the UN and the World Bank for complicated procedures, I'm on the board of the Green Climate Fund, and we're complaining that it's so difficult to do business with us. But when I'm actually the one that have imposed all these regulations and these issues on the World Bank, the UN system, and the GCF, not meaning me personally, but we as donors, we are loading everything on them. And that also is a key reason why some of these processes and as procedures are getting complicated. And I think it's important to understand that. So of course, we from our side, we try to be as effective as possible and not demand that you have all kinds of policies, but that is just a matter of fact. So what is needed then for all of us so we can tap into this market? Maybe start off with you, Mark, because you offered to provide a little bit more insights into what the GPA is doing and has done in terms of coming up with business models that are at least seems to be working in this area. So over to you, Marcus. I'm Mark.
Thank you, Hans-Olav. I think to achieve this target of 80% renewable electricity by 2030, we as UN need to be thinking differently. And we need to be not only walking the talk, but providing leadership and driving opportunity on this topic. We don't at present have the resources or mechanisms, unfortunately, to support the transition to cleaner fuels at scale, although we're hoping with additional funding, the Decarbonising Humanitarian Energy Body Partner Trust Fund can support peacekeepers and other UN agencies to scale up the response without having to reinvent the wheel. That's how much we believe in what we're doing with NORCAP and UNDP on the decarbonisation piece. But I think one of the key things that we cut to the chase is that when we're looking at switching from diesel-based infrastructure to solar solutions, the UN rarely has the capital to invest in clean energy technologies, despite these promising payback periods. As the UN and as Hans-Olav has already mentioned, our policies are that we cannot take loans. We have to have the money in the bank before we can move forward on these types of projects. And securing funding for, say, solar solutions is a challenging process, especially for the humanitarian perspective, because many of the traditional donors are looking to have impact on the mandate of that UN agency, not the energy infrastructure. For instance, if we talk about humanitarian settings, many of the traditional donors are looking at how many displaced people they've supported with its financial contribution, not how much CO2 it's offset, which is understandable. So with many of our partners, we're then directed to development colleagues to see if we can get funding for this transition from them. But as soon as we mention that we're working in displacement settings, we're directed back to the Foreign Office and their colleagues working in displacement settings, because providing energy in such settings is not development work, but humanitarian work. I would hope that the dialogue on this would be much stronger and easier with our peacekeeping colleagues. So if we can't get the capital up front, we are looking at other delivery solutions, such as agreements and leasing agreements. I heard from the earlier panel that these have already been discussed. And briefly, this is where the energy system is owned, operated, and maintained by a third party. This this delivery mechanism actually moves the cost for the solution away from capital investment to an operational cost, which is much easier for the UN to absorb. And to a certain extent, why we're overly reliant on diesel-based energy infrastructure. It requires very little capital investment and has a higher ongoing operational cost. We would like to invert that. So we feel that switching to power purchase agreements and leasing agreements would increase our ability to move decarbonising the UN along at a much greater pace. But I think it's really important to note a couple of challenges that still need to be addressed. Firstly, power purchase agreements and leasing agreements are multi-year contracts, and therefore under UN rules, it must include a termination clause within the contractual documents.
Could you be a little bit short now, Mark? Since we are running out of time.
Speed up. Yep. This is very challenging for the commercial sector because we're reliant on the private sector's really reliant on sort of 10-year contracts to be able to get the private financing. But with this termination contract, we only have a 30-day notice period. So we're working with partners to develop a de-risking mechanism, which we can compensate companies should their contract be terminated early. And my last point, really briefly, is this is a new approach for the UN, which then tends to lengthen contract negotiations and timeframes, but there is experience within the system. So we should be sharing existing templates and knowledge to really fast-track that forward. Back to you, Hans-Olav.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark said, Yvette and Saratullah, UN doesn't have the capital to invest. You're basically, if I can reframe it a little bit, how can we move from Opex to capex? Because in essence, that's what are the current discussions inside the UN on that possibilities? And Marcus, you have the capital, at least. You can borrow from the World Bank, and you can also get cheap loans from IDA. And Håvard, private sector, have the capital. How can we start bringing all of this together so we can move this issue forward? I don't know if that made sense, all these questions. I'm going to bring you, Camilla, in as well, but maybe starts with our UN colleagues.
Very difficult question.
But what can we as member states do in order to help you out?
Definitely, from the procurement perspective, what I'm speaking, whenever we put an interest out in the market, whether it's UN Procurement Division or any other UN organization, whenever you see maybe you could help from the member state perspective to help your own, industry, within your own countries to encourage more vendors to express their interests. This is where we're lacking interest from the market to come and say, okay, yes, I would like to see what the UN is doing. Can we participate? And this is where we'd like to continue reaching out to all member states within here, Secretariat, and as I mentioned earlier, other trade fairs or other business seminars to see how we can increase this pool of vendors. And from vendors' perspective, we would like to, as soon as we locate them and as soon as we can identify them, then we can start educate them on what is the procurement process, how can you participate, what's the information that you need from PD, from the procurement, to understand how to participate. And the more they participate, the more the vendors will understand more and more on the procurement process. Unfortunately, there is no other way but to go through public procurement for UN Secretariat, and that is a key thing. So understanding the procurement framework, the financial rules and regulations of the UN, the more this is understandable by the vendors, and everything is available on our websites. Obviously, procurement manual is even available so that could be read and understood. And the more they participate in vendors, the more the opportunities will happen for them.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Saratullah, from your perspective?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, obviously, as Mark mentioned, the renewable energy initial investment capital cost is an issue for the UN, as we have our operational budget, but in terms of renewable energy, the initial capital investment cost is significant. Rough estimates, we will need more than $500 million to reach that 80% of target of renewable energy. So that is a challenge. However, there are huge opportunities as well for the private sector to come forward and utilize that opportunity, and how offer UN and local communities through multi-stakeholder partnership with utilities, government, and obviously financiers to come forward and how help the UN with that capital investment, while UN as a reliable customer being there and have an identified demand for the energy, and as a key stakeholder to anchor that investment and that capital cost is an opportunity for the private companies. Also, there are some challenges for making PPAs and other forms of energy as a service agreement for the time being. We have our contractual challenges, which Mark also mentioned, that termination clause, which is like for short-term, very short-term, like 30 days. And for such a huge investment, we need longer-term partnership and long-term contract agreements. Obviously, our mandates are for 1 year, mostly extendable, but we cannot assure the vendors or the private investor that yes, it will be extended. We have a recent experience in Mali where our mandate was like just terminated, and we have to come out from that country. So in such a situation, there is a risk, and there is a need for de-risking mechanism to secure the reimbursement for the private investors.
Could you start concluding?
Sorry?
Could you start concluding?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, sure. Yes, that is one approach, and as I mentioned, we also have our in-house or inside the camp investment, which we are doing, but that will, in most, if we achieve like 100% utilize the land availability, we will go to 25% of renewable energy from our in-house inside the camp investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcus?
Yeah, well, I think it's, to the question of Opex versus capex, I think it makes a lot of sense for the UN to be outsourcing this ambition, as it were, to bring in the private sector to do it. I think it's, essential that, if you're asking anybody to come in and make a long-term investment where it's necessary to have, several years at least to be able to recover that investment, you need to have long-term agreements, power purchase agreements and so on. I agree that you need to have the things like termination agreements and everything. It doesn't have to be so complicated. I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of body of work out there on how to do these things, how to, put arbitration in place and so on. So I think if one approaches this from the mindset of just trying to use common sense to solve the problem is, the solutions are within reach. And I guess maybe one other thing is to say that, in many cases, the investor community, you get all sorts of types of investors with different motivations. But in this case, I think the investor community it's a very well, first of all, these are not project finance deals. You're not going and asking big banks like Citibank and SocGen and so on to lend to a project. You're dealing with mostly equity investors, and most of these equity investors are impact investors. They have to make a return, but they also care about the humanitarian purpose behind the project. And so you're dealing with a very like-minded group of stakeholders. So I think, I think honestly, the Somalia project is a great template for how things can be replicated, both in Somalia and Sudan, South Sudan, and other countries as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Håvard, private sector. interest? Where do you see the flows going?
I think in terms of involving the market sector, kind of the market powers themselves can contribute. Given that the last 10 years we've seen kind of a massive decrease in the cost of, say, solar panels and batteries, which are kind of the two workhorses of the energy transition. And that's kind of, although that trajectory has flattened out somewhat, it's still a trajectory we see going downwards. So kind of delivering, for instance, that combination becomes cheaper and cheaper for private actors to kind of jump on. Of course, that doesn't address, for instance, the political risks that Marcus mentioned. But still, kind of the market powers are in favor of things becoming inherently cheaper for renewables. But then there's also kind of a risk on the flip side of this. So I believe, Mark, you mentioned those 70 million in savings of fuels, right? Which I'm sure takes in some assumption on a certain fuel price reflecting today's diesel price. We don't know what that's going to be like in 3-5 years, right? In kind of a historic setting, they're fairly high right now. So that might also come in and kind of disrupt all of this. But yeah.
Thank you. I see that we are running out of time, so I will then ask the panelists for 30-45 seconds each to come up with 3 advices, messages to our private sector colleagues, because we're going to try to be good Swedes, because if you notice, I'm handing over to Swede afterwards, and the Swedes, they always make 3 points when they make interventions. So I will ask you then to give us 3 key lessons, key advices to private sector. So I'll do the reverse order. So I start with you, Marcus.
Okay. I think that there is more that the UN and the World Bank can be doing to help forge the investment environment in fragile countries where UN peacekeeping operations are taking hold. I think for the private sector, clearly there are a lot of procurement processes and Byzantine, labyrinths one has to sort of mazes to walk through to get, same with the World Bank, by the way, it's not just the UN, but, go through that process. And I think for us, the World Bank, for the UN system, we need to figure out how to try to be as efficient as possible. And then I think the other thing is just, we all need to just take the lessons from the people who've done this successfully so far, or doing this, and try to figure out how to replicate it and just push things forward and scale up.
Thank you. Camilla?
Thank you. I think my advice goes both to the UN and the private sector, really, and some critical success factors that we have seen through our work in the humanitarian sector is the need to develop business models that move away from the historical transactional relationship between the UN and private sector to a partnership-driven model. That is very important. Then it's the importance of local community engagement and participation to ensure long-term sustainability through market creation, because that will last, that will ensure demand longer than the humanitarian operations and also increase scale. Then the third point is scaling of projects and transitioning from pilots to sector-wide initiatives. There's been a lot of pilots happening, smaller pilots. We need to scale up operations to make the projects more investable for the private sector, also mentioned earlier. Then also the importance of the availability of de-risking mechanisms to attract private sector financing, and also a wider range of capital and funding sources, and to move away from traditional grant-based approaches.
Then you've used 1 minute and 15 minutes, so no Mark.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. 3 things. Keep an eye on the DHE Multi-Partner Trust Fund and our countries of interest for future market dialogues, where you'll get to understand what the opportunities are within that country. I think one of my colleagues already mentioned it. Do get to understand the UN procurement rules. They're a challenge, but once you get to understand them, it does make the whole process look easier to understand. And I think the last one really is just breathe. This process takes a long time to unpack, and it is a challenge. So please help us, hold our hands, and let's develop solutions together. Back to you, Hans-Olav.
Thank you. Saratullah.
Yes, thank you. There is a significant opportunity for the private investor or private companies. We are spending around 80 million per year on energy, so there is an opportunity for each one of the private company to help us and come forward. Our procurement process looks complex, but once you go through one of them, it will be much easier in the later stage. And we have resources to guide you through each of our process. We have our procurement team always available to respond to your clarification requests. So in case it looks complex, there is ways that we can navigate you through, and we hope you will participate in our future solicitation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yvette?
Well, I echo what Saratullah has mentioned, obviously, and all the colleagues in terms of the procurement hurdles that they look like hurdles, but once you understand them, it's not that complex. I do encourage that the more you participate, the more you learn, and it's really not that complex. Yeah, that's
Okay,
it.
thank you.
Thanks.
Olav?
I guess I'll pick up on something you said, Marcus, in kind of your intro, or at least when I was showing that hierarchy, I was absolutely saying that kind of stakeholders will usually prioritize reliability and then cost and then sustainability. But we're increasingly moving to a world where those are one and the same, kind of as a function of the availability and price of renewable power sources going down. And also kind of where concepts such as decentralized or microgrids aren't just applicable to the kind of conflict zones, but are part of a wider trend globally too.
May I say one more thing, just one more thing to the vendors as well? I was thinking also, you could reach out to us if you have any business model in mind to help achieve what we are all talking about here. If you can reach out to us, we can organize a meeting, call the technical people, and see what are the business models that you're thinking of to achieve the targets that we were talking about. So we welcome that as well.
Thank you. Before closing, hurdles, we can always jump over them. We have the best 400-meter hurdle runner in the world, the Norwegian. And so it's actually possible. Of course, we cannot go straight through all the hurdles, but there are a number of hurdles in this business, but I'm quite sure that collectively we can overcome them. So the 3 points that I'm picking up before I'm handing over to the next moderator, the case has been made. There are great business opportunities. Of course, the market and geopolitical fundamentals are driving in our direction. But of course, it's not an easy market to tap into. We have the emerging business models, and they have been mentioned from Mark and also from Marcus. We have the PPA, we have leasing arrangements, but it needs to be long-term, and we need especially to focus on how we can share the risk, and that's something we will dive more into in the next section. And finally, of course, we need partnerships, because we all need to work together. We need to share lessons and experiences, and we already tried to do this at this event, where we have the peacekeeping community and the humanitarian community. And I think it's important that when we start looking at the risk-sharing arrangements, that we do what we are best at, that we're not all of us doing the same thing. And we don't need a lot more pilot projects. No, we need to go to scale. The only pilots we need are the ones that bring us safely down when we are out flying. So now we need to get our act together and scale up and move forward, because the world needs that. With those words, thank you very much, and then I'm handing over to Johanna as the next moderator, but we will have a short coffee break, because I've seen my colleague is shaking her head. So then, sorry?
A nice lunch just on the next panel, huh?
Okay. So we have a good lunch coming up. So Johanna, the floor is yours, and thanks to the panelists.
Thank you.